Welcome to Sur-Ron South's video on how to fit a tail tidy to the Sur-Ron Lightbee L1e. In the UK, the L1e is the road legal version of the Lightbee and comes with a rear mudguard tail light unit and registration plate holder. Often, owners remove this or move the lights and plate up underneath the seat. A tail tidy is available that makes this look much better. So, let's begin. We will need to remove the trim pegs and holders from the plastic fairing underneath the seat. There are 8 of these trim pegs and their holders. 3 on each side on the outside and 2 on the inside nearest the battery. Using a trim tool or pick, remove all of these. Take your time and be careful not to scratch the bike. Keep these pegs and holders somewhere safe for fitting back in later. The rear seat fairing can now be removed easily. Now we move down to the rear light cluster and extra mudguard. To remove this, we need to undo but not remove the rear axle. Start this process by adjusting the chain tension nuts and bolts to loosen the tension using a 10mm spanner. Undo the axle nut using a 17mm socket on the chain side and a 6mm hex driver on the other. This requires some force. Remove the nut and spacer from the sprocket side and pull the axle out just far enough to allow the mudguard bracket to come free. You do not need to completely remove the rear axle. Remove the rear cluster and lay on the ground. Do not pull against the wiring. Undo the bolt that holds the brake pipe and wiring to the frame. We need to remove the rear light cluster and extra mudguard. Undo the screw to access the wiring. We will come back to this later. Clip the cable ties holding the wiring to the cluster mudguard bracket. Undo the 3 screws that hold the light cluster to the mudguard. Disconnect the wiring from the lights. Then pull the wiring through and clear of the swing arm. The mudguard can now be removed from your workbench. Remove the license plate bolts and washers, setting those and the plate aside until later. Undo the 3 nuts that hold the rear light together and disassemble the light into its component parts. Undo the nuts holding the indicators onto the frame. We will fit the rear light to the new tail tidy first. The plastic surrounds on the light bolts are a very tight fit, but the bolts will pull the light in as you tighten them. Next, we will fit the indicators. Line them up with the mounting holes and secure in place with the nut and washer that you removed earlier. Before we mount the tail tidy, we need to run the wiring up underneath the seat. Remove the battery from the bike to gain access to the 2 trim bolts at the rear of the compartment and one on the left side of the bike. Above the rear pulley are 2 screws holding the plastic trim in place. Loosen these and feed the wires from the light through into the battery compartment. Once the wire is through, tighten up the screws. Replace the 2 bolts in the rear of the battery compartment. We are now going to remove the rear seat to better allow access for the wires to run back to the light. Undo the 2 nuts and washers holding the rear mudguard on and the 2 nearer the battery compartment. Unclip the rear mudguard and remove the seat. Note that this L1e has the tracker installed and will need to be disconnected prior to the seat being pulled clear. Moving back to the battery compartment, we are going to remove the bolt holding the plastic trim on the left side of the bike. This allows us to feed the wire through alongside the tracker wiring through the frame. Feed the wire through and secure it behind the plastic trim inside the battery compartment. This stops the battery from pulling against the wiring during removal and insertion. A cable tie to the existing tracker wiring will help to keep the wire in place. Once this is done, reattach the plastic trim. Now we need to reconnect the tracker as we replace the seat. Replace the nuts on the bolts nearest the battery compartment and tighten. Feed the wire around the frame along the seat. Clip the rear mudguard back in place. Bring the tail tidy onto the back wheel and reconnect the wires. We have found that the top of the tail tidy could allow water ingress, so we would recommend that once you have tested everything that you cover the connection and wire entry holes within the tail tidy with sealant. you will notice that there is an excess of wire. Some of this can be cable tied up within the tail tidy, but the remainder can be loose under the seat fairing. Fit the tail tidy in place with the seat bolts protruding through the tail tidy. These bolts are not very long, so you will need to press the tail tidy in well to tighten the bolts. You may also need to make a slight bend to the tail tidy to let it fit well. Now we need to fit the rear fairing back on. This will now be a much tighter fit, so start with the trim pegs nearest the battery compartment and work your way along, pressing the fairing tightly against the seat frame. Replace the brake pipe clip and tighten carefully, ensuring you do not twist the plastic clip. Replace the rear axle spacer and nut, and then adjust the chain tension bolts to make sure that the recess on the spacers lines up with the same markings on the chassis on each side of the bike. This ensures that the wheel and sprocket are aligned correctly. A spanner can be wedged into the chain to stop the wheel rotating whilst you tighten and torque up the axle nut to 50 to 55 Newton meters. Reattach the license plate to complete the installation of your tail tidy.